Hello everyone, James running Adaptive Programs. Michael, thank you very much to you and your panel. Now, as Michael mentioned, we're going to be moving on now from the world of voice, from the world of messaging and Uber messaging, which is communications platform as a service, to look now, so those were the opportunities, those were the growth opportunities. We're now going to look at the challenges and the bad stuff, the bad actors that one often finds all around the world in so many different areas, and what we as an industry need to do to combat the constant attacks that subscribers at the end of the day come under. Now, I'd like to introduce to you now Simeon Coney, who's the Chief Strategy Officer of ENEA AdaptiveMobile. Simeon, hi.
Hey, James.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you indeed to ENEA AdaptiveMobile for sponsoring another MEF event. Great having you with me. The last time we spoke was at MEF CONNECTS Business Messaging in Amsterdam. This time we're approaching a similar topic, but from a very different angle. I know you've got a presentation, so would you like to take that away, and then we can have a discussion as we go along and through as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, James, as you mentioned last time when we spoke, we were looking at this very much from a regulatory perspective. This time we thought we'd look at it really from quite a different angle, really looking at it from the perspective of what are we seeing out there that is affecting predominantly enterprises as frankly the folks who are generating a lot of the traffic. What are the risks facing their business? So today, what I wanted to talk about is what I would characterize as sort of the top 5 most interesting threats facing enterprises right now. So along that line, I mean, what we're seeing is that there is a constant changing threat landscape. I mean, what holds true 1 year, even 1 month, certainly evolves and changes based upon a wide variety of factors. But the thing that is consistent throughout these is that the impacts are affecting reputation of businesses. It affects finances. You know, there is money taken out of this system. It impacts businesses, the profitabilities. And also, unfortunately, the attacks continue to grow in volume and severity, no matter what countermeasures, controls, regulations are put in place. I mean, we hear about the continuing rising wave of robocalls, even a year after all the work on Stir Shaken. Likewise, you know, the messaging industry has been very proactive, really, for the last 10, 15 years in providing defenses, but it doesn't stop the attacks occurring. So what I wanted to cover today was really looking at 5 quite new or different attack types. So starting with that, let's look at number 5. What we're now starting to see is a new set of techniques that are using existing services, existing quite legitimate services for fraudulent purposes. And what's particularly interesting is the way that they're exploiting effectively a full ecosystem of connectivity to gain financial benefit here. So specifically, what we're seeing is, you know, there's a broad range of services out there that when you sign up as a new customer, you enter your registration details, and often you're sent a welcome message. So, of course, part of that registration process is providing details of the mobile phone number you'd like to be contacted. The validation of all of this user information, you know, sort of name, address, location, and phone number, you know, a whole set of attributes. Often the businesses doing that won't necessarily have a view of the implications of the values of that data. And what we're seeing now is that some businesses are suffering when those registrations are occurring and the numbers being used, being added into these, are actually for very high risk, high cost destinations. And you know, when we look at this in context, you know, these businesses have no knowledge of, really, frankly, telecoms cost base. They got no knowledge of message rates. They don't know what are high risk destinations. I mean, certainly they may have a view of what country they've launched services in, but how many are validating data entry forms for that sort of intelligence? Certainly not many small businesses.
Sorry, so Simeon, sorry about interrupting here, but at that point, so with these smaller businesses you mentioned, the only point they would understand something has gone wrong is when they receive the bill at the end of the month.
Exactly that, James. Yeah. And, you know, at that point, yeah, the traffic's been generated. Everybody in the chain has incurred their costs and passed it on up the stream. And as you say, it ends up with a huge bill shock to these businesses. They had no knowledge of that. Everyone else in the chain has been conducting it. If we actually look at the message itself, the message is legitimate. It's the destination that makes it abusive.
And you've seen smaller businesses in particular being targeted for this because of that exact reason, that they don't have this awareness and they don't have the analysis of all the information available that day. So they're just being taken for a ride, essentially.
Actually, we're seeing it across a broad range. So yes, I mean, certainly small businesses, but also some of the, the major internet brands out there as well. I mean, it just goes to show that if even the big organizations who likely have their own security teams and fraud organizations and, customer data management don't have that in place, certainly the smaller businesses won't either. So yeah, I mean, this map illustrates just some of the destinations. I mean, this is truly a widespread problem. And I would say, actually, probably, James, the bigger the business, the more plausible it is that they might have people signing up for services in those destinations. And really, it's only when they start, as you say, to open the envelope of the bill at the end of the month, will they actually realize what has happened there. So when we look at, what does this actually look like? I mean, I just showed you some examples of the destinations. This is some examples of the volumetrics here that occur. These are folks who are clearly testing something, checking if it's working, and then firing at full speed. And the potential for revenue is pretty significant here. They're doing it because it works. Unfortunately, it's the same adage in security. If there's a weakness, they'll exploit it. So really volumetric, but careful volumetric, because of course you don't want to stop legitimate traffic, can be one countermeasure. Looking at, relative rate changes and even absolute rate changes could be another one. What really comes a factor here is combining intelligence across domains. So looking at risk profile of destinations, profiling the behavior of that account and saying, is this typical or is this unusual? And looking at things like saturation density, what's the ratio of contact to destination number? So a range of actually quite sophisticated techniques, and more importantly, a range of techniques that span domains is really what we're finding to be an effective way of addressing this particular problem.
So those targeted areas, does it link back into the LANC telecom session, for example, where we were talking about the correlation between a high-priced area and more incidents of fraud? Is that a definite correlation you're seeing?
Absolutely, exactly that, James. Yes, yeah, very much so. I mean, frankly, those destinations are so attractive that yes, there is a good bias to that.
But how do you stop? Because we heard as well, we've been hearing through this event and yesterday as well, that the temptation is for many just to say, okay, do you know what? I'm going to block whole number ranges, and I'm going to block that whole operator or even a whole country, because I'm just getting too many problems for that. And that can hurt so many people with legitimate traffic from doing that. So it needs to be stopped before it gets to that point.
Exactly that. Yeah. And really, if measures are put in place that isolate destinations, the consequences of that for so many services can be really significant. I mean, SMS is used for informational services. It's used for digital well-being. It's used for health. It's used for finance. It's used for so many capabilities that cutting countries off really should not even be a last resort. We really need to ensure that legitimate traffic flows freely. And what we're doing here is actually keeping everyone safe from the abusive use, not just abusive messages, as in, here is a message, by looking at it, we can tell it's bad, but actually abusive behaviors of legitimate service. So that's area number 5. Moving on up the charts to number 4, brand phishing. So in this instance, I mean, brand phishing isn't new. It's been around, unfortunately, for many years. What we're finding, though, is that the sophistication and the techniques are absolutely increasing in technique, capability, and effectiveness. You know, the issue for enterprises is that there's twofold. Their customers are being attacked, trying to steal account credentials, and actually now increasingly their staff are being attacked, trying to access system credentials in order to be able to compromise information sources, capabilities, services, etc. So, I mean, we are absolutely seeing a big increase in credential theft attempts. And interestingly, spanning a range of techniques. I mean, I've put some examples here of, you know, just one brand and the examples of creativity that we're seeing in domain names, but also we're seeing social engineering attacks. I mean, the example here on Uber looks very, very legitimate, but you can spot here the reply stop. They're trying to engage in a social interaction. You know, if they can prompt an interaction, a conversation, that can become the thin end of a wedge to start to gain personal information that will then be used against users. So looking at mitigation for these, first off, you know, the traditional techniques of analysis of call to action absolutely plays a role. You know, analysis of things like suspicious URLs, again, very much to the forefront. Unfortunately, what we're finding now is that it's so easy to gain disposable domains or temporary domain registration, and people are exploiting that to create hundreds of thousands of domains. You know, gone are the days of having a great plausible one or two looking domains. We're now seeing literally domains being used in campaigns, maybe only 100 messages before they rotate and use a new domain. So the technique of blocking on a URL and having that effective with a lifespan of months is well and truly gone now.
Simeon, are you seeing any moves as a result of that for any controls or any form of regulation on the domain name registrars? Because it's rather like if I pitched up to someone and say, hey, yeah, I'll have 10,000 SIM cards, please. Those days, decade ago, 15 years ago, particularly let's say a distributor would have gone, no problem, James, here you go, just pay your money, you've got your 10, 15,000 SIM cards. That ability is present today for domain names. And why would I, as an individual, want a block of 10,000 different domain names legitimately? Is anyone actually looking at that area? Are any regulators looking at that? Are there any controls in that area at all?
It's a good question. I mean, I'm not aware myself of any regulation. I mean, I think part of the challenge is regulation tends to be very parochial to an individual country. And this is a global problem. I mean, all it takes is a registrar of, you know, a relatively plausible looking top level domain in a region, and they can offer and sell whatever websites they want behind that. And that's, you know, it creates a business. Everyone benefits because they get a cut of the action there. So it's almost in their interest to support and facilitate this type of disposable business. And of course, they hold their hands up and say, all we're doing is selling names. We don't have any idea of what the site being hosted provides. But yeah, we're not really seeing an industry-wide initiative that would actually clamp down and close all of the loopholes. Certainly the big registrars have got brilliant takedown services. Trouble is, domains are being hosted by so many providers.
Okay.
And of course, we also end up with the same issues that when sites, for example, using things like WordPress get compromised. You know, every time there's a new WordPress compromise, we see a whole new wave of attacks using legitimate domains and legitimate sites being used to host bad content too. So part of it's domain registration, but also we're at the mercy of the same weaknesses as the broader internet community there. And as I mentioned, techniques like sort of volumetrics, they don't work in these environments. I mean, we've heard of spear phishing and whaling, you know, whaling attacking the CXOs of a business, spear phishing. You know, we've seen precise targeting, you know, aiming at employees and locations where employees are living and working solely there, keeping the volumes well down below the typical detection thresholds of any normal sort of fraud detection mechanism there. They absolutely know the common techniques for defense. There's a lot of intelligence and effort being applied by attackers in this space. And actually, the other point to note on this is that, frankly, I feel a lot of the message senders aren't helping themselves. This is an example of two messages. One of these is legitimate. One of these users should be trained to respond to. The other one is not. The other one is a fake message that will lure somebody in. I mean, James, I've got you on the microphone here. Have a guess.
You have. Do you know what? As soon as I saw this, I thought, uh-oh, I'm going to be tested here. I would say the second one is fake, even though it looks more realistic from the text and how intelligently it's put together. Am I wrong?
You're actually right. The second one is fake.
It looks smarter. It looks so professional, and people would click on that. So that's the only reason I'm saying that, is because I know what you've been saying. Yeah.
I mean, gone are the days of looking for the spelling mistakes.
Yes.
What's particularly of note is, I would say, the attackers have done a better job than the brand in finding an acceptable looking URL bit.ly there. They've got Bank of A, whereas the other one has just got frankly, a selection of letters and numbers.
Totally. But the thing is, can I ask you, Simeon, we as in MEF, we have the SMS Sender ID registry program. So we're active in the UK and Ireland and Spain. And something I see constantly coming up are frustrations with certain companies, and a lot of them actually tend to be in the parcel delivery realm, who have been rather slow to understand the benefits of subscribing to something such as the registry, which helps get a handle on smishing, SMS phishing. And so their brand is being used. These are big brands we all know, whether in the UK or other countries, the brands are going to be similar. And their brand is being misused. But because the misuse of their brand actually does not impact them directly, it would impact not even their clients directly, who are the retailers, let's say, sending a pair of shoes to myself. It would impact myself. They don't seem to be paying too much attention to this. It's starting to get through now, but there seems to be a lack of understanding and awareness that these brands really have to jump on this. This is what we're seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, certainly on the topic of sort of sender identities, hold that thought.
We're coming to that. Yeah.
But yeah, I think, though, again, another attack that we have, I think, has the same impact, which is, if consumers feel they can't trust the message they receive from a legitimate source because of attacks like this, it will damage them. I mean, parcel delivery companies, yes, they take the money from the sender, but it only works if they can contact the recipient and ensure that that person is there, available for the delivery. The user's not opening the message. And I mean, we've heard numerous times now from, for example, folks like the Mobile Squared team, user opening of messages is starting to decline. When that occurs as a result of lack of trust, I think the whole ecosystem, frankly, needs to pay attention.
Good point. And that's now. Yep.
So moving on through the attacks, moving to a more technical one now, in fact, more of a hidden attack. So the other ones we've been looking at, very visible to either the brands or, in the previous case, the end user. SS7 attacks against brands. Again, not a technically new attack, but again, we're starting to see increased usage, particularly of things like interception and redirection of messaging. I would point everyone's attention towards a great report written by the Fiji team, which is the Financial Inclusion Global Initiative team of the ITU. This team actually looked specifically at the financial industry, and they looked at how they were being affected as a result of things like message redirect, because of course the consequences of a bank security token, whether it be an MTAN or a one-time password, are very significant. High value transactions, low volume, high value. And two particular charts that in this report that really caught my eye. Firstly, the figure one, what frequency of attacks? I mean, yes, there is 13% that said no attacks. I mean, I always ask the question, is no attacks, we're not aware of any attacks, or there were no attacks? But certainly you can start to see that actually these numbers are increasing here. I mean, 18% are saying between 10 and 100 attacks, 61% less than 10, but they're occurring. And again, that adage of security, if it works, they will do it. You know, if it makes them money, they'll do it more. And so when we look at things like message interception, you know, this is something that is completely outside of the control of the enterprise. But their whole approach is that is a trusted mechanism that gives them connectivity through to the end user. It's an additional authentication mechanism of that user. And when that trust breaks down, that affects the end user and it affects the sending brand and it affects us, the ecosystem. So when we look at mitigation, you know, there's some great standards that have been written here. I mean, typically these 4 GSMA standards are very, very good reference documents covering quite a broad range of attacks. What's particularly worrying, again, looking at the results of the survey done by ITU, is when we look at the implementation of these standards inside operators. Yes, I mean, the first stat here is that 87% of operators have done something on home routing. Now that's great for one particular type of fraud. 70-odd% are doing filtering on transit. The question is what type of filtering? But actually, when we look at firewalling, we're down to 28%. And firewalling is one of the techniques strongly recommended and endorsed in those standards. You know, if you don't have the controls, how are you even seeing the visibility of attacks? Which plays to the previous chart. Is that actually a true picture of what's going on?
So the responsibility to protect against this form of attack, would you say this lies principally with the mobile network operators?
Yeah, in fact, solely with the mobile network operators. Okay. I mean, these are attacks against their infrastructure. So outside of any of the infrastructure of aggregators or CPaaS, this is once a message has been handed over for that final terminating network delivery.
So here, when you talk about firewall, you're talking really about an SS7 signaling firewall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indeed. And there are additional countermeasures that can be put in place, like IMSI checking and location checking and things like that. But those are quite intensive, very effective solutions, but those are going to be done only by the few rather than the many operators. So working our way up the top 5, we're now at number 2. Artificial traffic inflation. I mean, I know we've spoken about this on numerous MEF sessions. In fact, I think we've had quite a few people contribute quite a lot of intelligence. It is growing. I mean, we are continuing to see activity across a broad number of regions. I mean, the impact of this and the number of folks it affects in the ecosystem, I think, can't be understated. And particularly what we're seeing is quite a fast evolution of techniques to try and avoid discovery, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The volumes are increasing. I mean, this is just one snapshot of the volume of artificial traffic affecting just one brand in one network to illustrate this. We're seeing well over 1/3 artificial messages per month in just one terminating network. Multiply that across a region, across a customer base. This is a significant problem. There's a lot of, it looks like, greed trying to over-egg this particular attack that's going to take a lot of traffic out, but unfortunately damage a lot of people in that time with some big consequences. And when we look at what's being done to detect this, I mean, first off, techniques weren't particularly sophisticated. They were using things like sequential number ranges, but we're now finding the use of extended numbers, differential number formats, and certainly very realistic looking numbers rather than sequential ranges. Traffic bursts, again, being addressed. There's a lot of clever phasing of traffic submission there. Delivery rate and retry rates, there's some really interesting mechanisms we're now seeing that will overcome the mechanism of looking for high failure rates. So actually does result in legitimate traffic delivery. When we look at what used to be artificial message content, can you use the content of the message to discover that? We're finding that there's been a migration to real message content as well. And when we look at the gapping of how are these messages actually submitted into the network, again, used to be very sort of predictable on a behavioral basis. We're now finding, again, it looks very organic, very realistic in a profile of how that traffic comes in. Now, it is still detectable. We are still finding large instances of this and blocking, but it shows the speed at which this is changing. Because, I mean, it was only, what, James, 3-4 months ago, I think, that we were talking about some of the countermeasures on the left.
It was the middle of June, yeah.
Yeah, and we're already finding the evolution of that. So, yeah, I think artificial traffic inflation is really a great cause for concern.
So if let's say if I was a bad guy, a bad actor, and I was doing it, and if you go back to that previous chart where you saw them suddenly get a bit excited, if they'd kept it at that really, really, really low level, that could have potentially gone on forever. It's
exactly that. Yeah, I mean, you've got a few sort of sacrifice accounts that burst high, and then they have a very, very long tail here. I mean, it shows the sophistication and the pervasiveness of how this actually comes out and how it affects.
Okay, thanks.
So, number one, it's not a new one, but I think it frankly, it will never get knocked off the top perch. Again, a growing problem, and that's grey routes. So, James, I mean, you mentioned earlier about sender registration. Sender registration is good when people are using or supposed to use a sender identity legitimately. But what we're seeing is so often, again, on a global basis, the sender ID being manipulated as a result of grey routes and the content being manipulated by grey routes. I mean, the pie chart here on the right shows the effect of this. So what we did is we looked at a broad set of messages, and we looked at how many times the identity was being changed from the point in which the enterprise had sent it to when the user received it. 3% of messages were delivered unaltered. In all other cases, they were either changing to a generic alpha, a standard long number, or in fact, even an invalid number. I mean, effectively something that was not in any way a plausible sending identity. And what this is doing is it's either encouraging people to respond to these fake identities, and we all know the security weaknesses that comes from encouraging that sort of behavior, or worse, it means people don't trust the legitimate messages, because the message is legitimate, it's the routing of it that isn't.
But Simeon, we've heard of real situations where enterprises or local authorities think they're doing the right thing, and they tell their customers or they tell citizens that you can, when you receive an SMS, a text message from us, you can expect to receive them from this particular sender ID. So they're telling everyone what sender ID it's going to come from. And by doing that, it's releasing it into the public domain, and a bad actor can get hold of that and go, well, fantastic, thank you very much, I'm going to use that. So education is important here as well. You think you're doing the right thing by sharing with your customer, this is what you can expect from me, this is when you know it's real, but by doing that, they could actually be hurting themselves.
Yes, in fact, I mean, the awareness of the sending identity creates a really nasty social engineering attack, which is the threaded inbox. I mean, what this means is when you spoof a message that appears to come from that same entity, it actually appears in the thread conversation with all of the other legitimate messages. So a user will look at these and go, well, I know that previous message and the one before that was legit and the one before that was legit. Therefore, this must be legitimate. People are conditioned in a habit of saying, well, if all those were good, this must be good.
We are, and you're not on your guard, and you're not looking at the exact content of that individual message. I don't think anyone really is. Yeah.
And in fact, I would say the worrying trend that we're really now seeing is we're operating the spam reporting service for a number of carriers. So these are reports of messages that users feel are spam, and absolutely huge increase in reports of legitimate A2P messages. People are just getting confused. They don't know what is good. They don't know what's bad. And if they can't trust a message, they won't respond to those legitimate services. I would say that is the biggest threat, which is when consumer trust is gone, they will look for alternate services. And if those alternate services aren't monetized by this ecosystem, that's a revenue loss.
I agree. Well, look at the previous sessions, we're talking about voice and robocalling. There's so much trust. If this phone, my home phone, was to ring now, odds on, unfortunately, it wouldn't be a legitimate call. That's the state in play we have here where I am with fixed line voice calls at the moment, or calls terminated to my fixed line. Yeah.
And as we hear so often, trust is binary. You know, it's not a slow, gradual erosion. The trust is gone, people don't respond, and that is a loss.
Yeah, it's a big loss. I think for me, the artificial traffic generation, you mentioned who standed to lose and why. It was everyone standed to lose from that. Absolutely every category, all four stood to lose, which I think is different from the others, because they would hit more one or two of the other categories, but that is really, really stark. That's real stark.
Yeah. I think the extent of that is of particular concern, because yes, you know, it's damaging the reputation of the carriers, it's damaging the reputation of the brands, it's damaging the reputation of the interim aggregators. It's also damaging the reputation of those primary aggregators who the carriers trust to deliver their message. You know, everyone ends up losing, and not just financially, but reputationally. Again, the trust.
Well, when it comes to grey routes, you talked about grey routes, and when it comes to routing at the end of the day is the product. When you're in the voice and the SMS world, your routing managers are so critical, because they're the ones with the relationships. They pull together the product at the end of the day, and the routing is king. People like talking a lot about moving to direct routes, cleaner traffic. We don't do this, we don't do that. But at the end of the day, isn't there still the temptation? If I'm an enterprise and let's say I'm in Germany where the typical SMS price is 6 euro cents, but let's say I didn't know that. I'm a small enterprise and someone comes along and offers a price of 2 euro cents for that message. I'm just going to go, wow, everyone else is saying 6, but they're going 2. I'm going to go for it. So the commercial model and that draw to that cheaper price is huge and can so easily negate so much of the good work being done by our industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, that's something I'd love to have the feedback of folks who have got those enterprise account relationships. But I feel as an industry, if only we were able to have something like an NCAP rating, you know, something that enabled people to be able to clearly and simply articulate the quality and the value for that price point. Because without that, it's just price.
Yes, absolutely. And there's so many businesses out there, this is not their primary concern. Telecoms as a whole is not their primary concern. They're all about making a product, delivering a product or a service, and this is not their concern. So it's up to us within the industry. So the mobile operators, the business messaging companies, CPaaS providers, aggregators, whatever you want to call yourself, to collaborate and eradicate this. Moving to the mobile network operators, you talked about the SS7 side of things, and the only way that can be stamped out is by the mobile network operators ultimately implementing an SS7 signaling firewall, but more to the point, having a good managed service. How are we doing globally, from your opinion, with regards to that? So deployments of SS7 signaling firewalls, and not just, Because when you say firewall, people automatically leap and think SMS firewall. But the SS7 side of things is just as, or actually, if not even more important. What's the industry doing? What are the trends with that globally?
Yeah, so, I mean, well, certainly a couple of good news points. I mean, first off, everyone is aware of it. You know, we've got those 4 GSMA standards. People are talking about it frequently. People are aware of the attacks. You know, there's a lot more, even media attention that is driving interest and demand on those. And when we look globally at the firewall deployments, again, great to see those are trending up. I mean, there was some great research again done by Nick at Mobile Squared on the number of firewall deployments that we're seeing again across the world. More and more operators are deploying this. Still come to the fact that unfortunately still only a quarter of operators in Europe have got those deployed. And frankly, if we look at the world, Europe ought to be the location with the highest rate of coverage there. So yeah, if we consider that across developing nations, you know, that number is a lot lower.
Fantastic. And indeed, in previous sessions, the topic of Africa keeps coming up. And are you seeing from your client base and the traffic and, let's say, threat origination points, are you seeing Africa as a key part of that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I mean, well, we're covered in 26 countries across the African continent. You know, such a broad range of technology adoption, service usage, and capabilities. And given the sort of the broad price points, it is seeing everything there. In fact, I mean, we're talking next week at the WAS conference on, again, some of the attacks and the risks that are facing particularly that region.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, so you're going to be in Cape Town next week, and indeed the MEF team and so many are going to be back in Cape Town at the beginning of November at AfricaCon. Simeon, it's time for us to wrap up this session, but if you had one word of advice for the ecosystem as a whole, what would it be when it comes to fighting fraud? Or one sentence, what would it be? What's the key thing here?
Well, one word would be education.
Okay.
2 would be awareness and education. You know, I think we're getting to the point where we know what we need to do. You know, we're never going to rest. You know, this is not a job that we can put our feet up and say job done. But
I think it's like eating healthily or drinking healthily. I think 99% of us know what we need to do. Whether we do it or not is a different story. Similar. Okay. So Simeon Coney, Chief Strategy Officer of ENEA AdaptiveMobile. Simeon, pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for sponsoring another MEF event. Much appreciated. And enjoy the rest of today. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Bye.